too fast for you, brother? You know how it is, Johnny.
Yeah.
Get older, it's rough.
Yeah.
Rough, you kidding? I'm into the golden years now.
Oh, really?
The golden years. That means you go to the bathroom 5 times a night. That's a golden. When your toes outnumber your teeth, that's the golden year. When the daily double is prune juice and an enema, that's the golden year.
You're talking your basic golden years,
Basic golden years. That's good. Basic golden years. That's good. Yeah.
Have you, just a transitional phrase there.
I know.
Have you seen your doctor lately?
I can't get my pocket back. I got the pocket back, right?
Okay.
Oh boy.
Have you seen
When you get older, you know, they say the first thing that goes is the mind. I said he missed by 3 feet, you know that?
Good morning. It's Tuesday, Ayn-Rand Tuesday, October the 17th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have Hugh-Hewitt, Squawk Box, My Take, Rules for Retrogrades, Rules for Patriots, No Free Lunch, The Rape of the Mind, Ayn Rand Quote of the Day, and Bishop-Barron, and Ayn Rand's book, Philosophy, Who Needs It? All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now there's No Free Lunch, 250 Economic Truths by David-Bahnsen.
Only if we understand why and how certain kinds of economic controls tend to paralyze the driving forces of a free society, and which kinds of measures are particularly dangerous in this respect, can we hope that social experimentation will not lead us into situations none of us want. F.A. Hayek. While Hayek was clearly writing about a much broader policy apparatus than just the minimum wage law, we certainly see minimum wage setting a tremendous example of what he was warning against. A law that is clearly driven by social experimentation has delivered unintended yet foreseeable consequences that cannot be considered positives for the society at large.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David-Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the rape of the mind.
The development of loyalty. From all this, we can see that what we call treason takes place more in the emotional than in the intellectual sphere of functioning. In the course of human growth, everybody passes through periods of inner conflict in which he has to turn his love and allegiance from one person to another, from mother to father, from parents to the entire family, from the family to the state, and from the state to mankind. The core of this problem of treason and self-betrayal is found in the difficulties which arise in the repression of former loyalties, as each loyalty is in turn superseded by the next. Many people experience deep confusion in adolescence when, for the first time, they must leave the safe emotional protection of their homes and create new loyalties and new moral standards for themselves. It is in this period that the critical faculties are developed. In doubting the traditional truths passed on by his parents, each adolescent might be called a traitor, yet he is actually being true to the self he is shaping. During the crisis of adolescence, with its increased feelings of yearning for some unknown happiness, many young people want to betray their parental home and their parents' standards. At the same time, they do not want to give up the protection the home offers. Psychologically, we know, however, that temporary disloyalty is part of the normal mental growth. In process of individual human development, there are stages of progress which lead from initial submission to open rebellion and nonconformity. Every step toward mental maturity and independence involves the growing out of ties with the past. This growth can be effected in different ways, with more or less overt hostility and forsaking of the past, with self-betrayal and passive submission, with renewed submission to pay off feelings of guilt, with sworn conservationism or open rebellion. In this phase of adolescence, he is especially vulnerable to totalitarian propaganda. The youth may retain from the conflict of inner growth a sense of loneliness and guilt. If he puts it to productive use, he may become what we might call a creative revolutionary. The trailblazer, whose own inner forces drive him on to break with tradition, is such a man. Indeed, many of mankind's great moral and spiritual leaders have been of this type. They have been leaders precisely because they broke either with rigid remnants of the past or with the ossified or immoral elements of the present. In my own experience, I have known one such man, a German psychiatrist, whose idealism and moral sense made it impossible for him to go along with the Nazi desecration of human values, and who was hanged as a traitor for his part in the abortive German rebellion against Hitler in 1944.
And that was The Development of Loyalty from The Rape of the Mind by Joost-meerlo, M.D. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades, 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
Rule 39. The retrograde rejects any and all racist, statist, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic perversions of conservatism associated with the alt-right. Alt-right is non-right. It is false conservatism. Ideological refuse to be identified, decried, and jettisoned. Intellectually, the alt-right worldview proves to be piffle, falderall, without pedigree. But practically, as a stalking horse in the popular mind for Catholic conservatism, it presents the mortal danger of mistaken identity. The radical news and commentary media will hasten to identify retrogrades as alt-right, because they customarily slander all non-moderate, non-tepid opposition parties in this boilerplate fashion. It is the new standard of radical Western journalism, depict any and all parties rejecting one world government and instead espousing national sovereignty as alt-right. Simply put, to be retrograde is to pose a superlative threat to the radical mainstream. We are the one true movement of classical anti-racism and anti-bigotry. Radicals will never be deterred from their calumnious false narrative by hard facts, however. The retrograde worldview insists on patriotism, borders, and turning back the clock for a highly specific reason: love of Christ and his moral code. The alt-right worldview merely apes these sympathies from a tawdry resentment for the Christian teleology which insinuates them. These alt-right rogues can easily be popularly confused for retrogrades because they customarily fight nuclear, like retrogrades. Like that of the retrogrades, alt-right rhetoric lacks the doddering domestic impotence of the mod cons. The alt-right is possessed of some fire in the belly, which makes it stand out amongst moderate mainstream wordplay. But their wicked principles are basically diametrically opposed to ours. The real secret behind the radical rush to characterize alt-right as conservatism inheres in the fact that alt-right is actually nothing more than the anti-globalist alt-left. Both rivals of the retrograde, radicals and alt-right, prove to be materialistic egalitarians who favor mob-rule democratic institutions which reject the timelessness of the immutable natural law and the dignity of the individual. Consider the identical nature of the radical left and the alt-right on the following substantial issues. They both favor centrally planned socialist economy. They both fixate on a determinist view of race and personal identity, whereas the retrograde adopts a position of Thomistic, colorblind individualism. They both harbor a cultural and policy antipathy to Christianity and a longing for a robust and binding surrogate for it. Each side cherishes abortion, population control, and eugenics. Moreover, modern radicalism is often implicitly neo-pagan, whereas the alt-right is explicitly neo-pagan. Consider this passage from an article in Vice. Quote, "There's a war going on in the American pagan community. On one side are racists who see gods like Odin and Thor as an embodiment of the supremacy whites have over the rest of the planet. On the other are the practitioners who believe these gods transcend racial lines and belong to everyone. Recently, the contention between these two groups has reached a tipping point as anti-racist pagans try to claim the narrative around their faith before it is overtaken by alt-right racists. Although the leaders of Nazi Germany were obsessed with paganism and the occult, it has largely been associated with multiculturalism here in the United States." Unquote. Like all paganism, all bigotry, all eugenics, all anti-Christianity, all collectivism, alt-right is to be repudiated wherever the retrograde encounters it, which is practically nowhere except on the internet, given the alt-right's exaggerated yet small presence in American life.
And that was Rules for Retrogrades, 40 Tactics to Defeat the Radical Left by Timothy and David Gordon. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve-Deace.
Much of the Republican infrastructure in that primary, still smarting from Santorum's Specter endorsement, also opposed Santorum and supported Romney. Faced with the prospect of a potential loss in his home state primary, Santorum dropped out rather than risk an embarrassing defeat that at worst would have ended his political career and at least would have undone a lot of the good he accomplished in his campaign up until that point. A good Catholic like Santorum will understand when I say Faustian bargains never pay off. Now, Santorum is not alone in having to learn that lesson. At the time this book was being written, Kentucky Senator Rand Paul was poised to inherit not just his father's revolution, but also expand it into the ranks of social conservatives who, like him, but were skeptical of his father's libertarian bent. However, Paul angered some of his father's longtime supporters when he endorsed Romney for president after his father suspended his bid. His father never did endorse Romney. And it wasn't just that Rand endorsed Romney, it was the way he did it. He heaped more praise on Romney on Fox News than liberal Republican Rudy Giuliani did. He even started repeating the same old talking points about having to work within the system. That's hardly the talk of revolution. Except people didn't join his father's revolution to work within the system. Revolutions want to topple systems. They joined his father's movement to drain the swamp. Paulistas correctly see the system as unsalvageable. They were hoping Rand would inherit his father's revolution, but smooth out his father's rough edges when it comes to presentation. This was not what they had in mind. One of the things Rand said in his defense at the time is the exact same flawed thinking that led the religious right down the primrose path for the past 30 years. As my last book, We Won't Get Fooled Again, Where the Christian Right Went Wrong and How to Make America Right Again, portrays in vivid detail. Rand said that he was close to getting a vote on auditing the Federal Reserve, something his father has advocated for years, and that the leadership of the Republican Party would be more willing to give him that vote if he supported the party's presidential nominee, unlike his father. But that, folks, is flat out wrong. In fact, the exact opposite is true. The only reason the Republican Party would be willing to provide Rand Paul a vote on auditing the Fed is because they're scared to death at what his father was able to accomplish in spite of them the past few years. In 2008, Ron Paul was getting laughed off the national stage as a quack for campaigning for president on auditing the Fed. 4 years later, almost all of his 2012 GOP campaign rivals had at least tacitly signed on to the concept. Why? Well, I suppose it's because they had all sincerely seen the light. But like it says in my favorite country song, don't pee on me and tell me it's raining. More likely, it's because Ron Paul nearly won the 2011 straw poll, then nearly won the 2012 Iowa caucuses, then got 40% of the I'm not Mitt Romney vote in the 2012 Virginia primary, and then saw his people take over the Republican Party in states like Maine, Nevada, Minnesota, and Iowa. The system is scared to death of the Ron Paul revolution, so they're trying to patronize it by offering a symbolic vote, which will fall a few votes short of winning, of course, in the hopes that it will be satisfied by this contrivance the way Christian conservatives were satisfied with such milquetoast for 30 years beforehand. Always remember, my fellow patriots who are challenging the system, whenever the system offers you something, you already have it. And that's exactly the entry point where the real negotiating starts. Except you shouldn't negotiate at all, but accept nothing less than unconditional surrender when the future is at stake for your children and grandchildren. Look to Alexander the Great for inspiration. In 331 BC, King Darius was attempting to stop upstart Alexander the Great's quest to conquer his empire. He sent Alexander a letter promising him a substantial portion of his territory and his daughter's hand in marriage if Alexander would agree to stand down. Alexander responded, quote, "What you offer me is already mine. As for your daughter, if I want to marry her, I will." In 330 BC, Alexander the Great conquered Darius's empire. If Rand Paul wants a real vote on auditing the Fed, then he should leverage his base that he inherited from his dad to force that vote upon the system by threatening them with it. That's how real reform happens, not by settling for scraps from the establishment's table. By playing the game instead of forcing the establishment's hand all over the internet, Paulistas were turning on Rand and then turning on each other for doing so. For example, one of the most active Ron Paul loyalists on Facebook posted this as his status update after Rand's endorsement of Romney, paraphrasing some of Rand's justifications. Quote, "I don't understand why people are upset about Rand Paul endorsing Mitt Romney. Sometimes when you fight for principles, you have to make compromises in order to ensure personal gain. Remember what Winston Churchill said during the Great Battle of Britain. England was always my first choice, but hey, Germany looks stronger now, so it's time to join them. Hitler, he comes from a large family, so we have that connection." Unquote. Ouch. That's going to leave a mark. Now, in Rand's defense, he got it right a few months later when he filibustered the U.S. Senate over the disclosure President Obama had a secret drone kill list intended to target American citizens. Stand with Rand became not just a meme that night, but a movement. Several of Rand's contemporaries, like Texas Senator Ted Cruz, came alongside him during that filibuster. That's the kind of leadership people are looking for. They're looking for champions who take on the system, not cater to it. Catering to the system is just what the hackneyed GOP establishment wants. Divide and conquer is the oldest strategy of them all. The Republican Party establishment is a Zen master when it comes to pitting conservative leaders against actual conservatives. We send leaders to Washington or our state capitals to fight on our behalf. Eventually they wear them down little by little until they become fully institutionalized by the system. And finally they return home to fight us for the system instead of fighting the system for us. By turning our leaders into their human shields, the Republican Party establishment deflects scrutiny and pressure from us to perform where it matters most. Public policy. I used to think the GOP stupidly fell into this trap of perpetual civil warfare out of cowardice. But eventually I figured out this was their plan all along. They co-opt our leaders so we believe we're fighting them when really we're fighting each other. That's why one of the last best hopes we have for reform via political activism in this country is the Tea Party movement, because it's spontaneous combustion. The longer the Tea Party movement avoids the temptation of creating a cabal of high-profile leaders perpetually on the Sunday morning talk shows and pretending to speak for its people, the better its chances to accomplish some real good. When the system pressures the Tea Party to become more organized, what it really means is hurry up and appoint some ambitious spokespeople so we know specifically who we have to buy off and co-opt. Whenever you hear the following phrases from your elected representatives, know that you and the conservative base are about to be abandoned or already have been. Phrases like, you have to be more realistic. Well, that's not how we do things around here. That's the way we've always done things. Rome wasn't built in a day. We'll get 'em next time or session. Half a loaf, better than none. We either hang together or we'll hang alone. Now understand this one is a total bastardization of the famous line from Benjamin Franklin, who was talking about everyone risking it all for liberty, when the system here is talking about individuals risking nothing for re-election. Or then there's this, you have to work within the system. When your elected representatives start regurgitating these Republicrat cliches back to you in the grassroots, get them out of the system and back home as soon as possible to get them around some good influences before it's too late. Remember, bad company always corrupts good character. Earlier in this book, we cited the 4 pillars of the left's power base: the child-killing industry, the homosexual agenda, educrats, and government sector employee unions. When was the last time you saw Democrat national leadership or prominent Democrats anywhere in the country abandon any of these bases? The left goes to war for their base, even to the point of shutting down the government or losing an election. Like when Vice President Joe Biden said the left would shut the government down if Republicans on Capitol Hill insisted on defunding Planned Parenthood during the debt ceiling showdown of 2011. Or when President Obama came out against marriage the day after North Carolinians affirmed it by almost 30 points. 40% of Democrats in North Carolina voted to affirm marriage as well. But they weren't the Democrats that represented the 4 pillars the left never abandons. Most of them were white working class or black Democrat voters. We have seen the left abandon ethnic and racial minorities as well as private sector unions, but we never see them abandon and betray the child-killing industry, the homosexual agenda, educrats, and government sector employee unions. So if you're a racial and ethnic minority, single mom, or a working class white that is a member of a private sector union, you need to know where you stand with the Democrats. It's quite simple, really. You don't. Or at the very least, you stand in the back of the line, behind Planned Parenthood, LGBT, or is it now LGBTQ, A, B, C, D, F, G? Do these people ever stop adding letters? NEA and AFSCME. You're their booty call. They'll use you when it's an election, but have no use for you after that. Now, let's look at the three groups that make up the traditional Reagan coalition. Values voters, that would be pro-life, pro-family voters. Limited government advocates like tax reformers, pro-growthers, libertarians, etc. And those who believe in a strong national defense like peace through strength. The Republicans have traditionally been seen as the strong national defense party. But there is little doubt and lots of evidence they have abandoned those of us in the other two groups repeatedly. In politics, you are what hills you're willing to die on. So based on their actual record of the past 2 decades, and not the rhetoric, we would say the leadership of the Democrat Party is for child killing, moral depravity, Islamists, anti-American progressive intellectuals, and statists. On the other hand, we'd have to say the leadership of the Republican Party is for morally indifferent crony capitalists that think it's our job to be the world's rent-a-cop. I'm guessing that's not the Republican Party most of you listening to this signed up for. At this point, the Republicrats are beyond salvaging and just need to be repealed and replaced, to borrow a popular phrase these days. But when we replace them with our own people, they must not make the mistake of abandoning us for them. And if they do, well, then we treat traitors accordingly.
And that was Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve-deace. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
We all have good days and bad days. We all have struggles. We all have deep disappointments. We all experience injustice. How can I take that injustice or that suffering or that lack of fairness and cooperate with it for God's purposes? Whatever suffering we're asked to endure. But again, don't just like, oh, I'm just passively enduring it. No. I got my antennae out, my spiritual antennae. I'm looking for what is God up to? What does he want? What's he inviting me to? What greater faith, hope, and love is he inviting me to exhibit? What apostolic opportunity is there? I'm being given an opportunity to participate in the sufferings of Christ, to join those sufferings to his, for the salvation of the world. We all have good days.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand quote of the day. Quote, "Statism needs war. A free country does not. Statism survives by looting. A free country survives by production." Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. So, Hugh-Hewitt, listening to him this morning, and he's asking a guest, he says, have you noticed a change in the narrative? And they're talking about the news media and how the news media is now shifting to as I told you they would do, because I've seen this again over and over again, switching to humanitarian crisis. It's no longer about Israel being illegally attacked, and the news media never said humanitarian crisis in Israel, only in Gaza. So we know that the news media is biased against Israel, and you have to keep that in mind. You realize that your enemy is the news media. Al Jazeera, CBS, NBS, ABS, etc. So, but even Hugh-Hewitt, the dim-witted Hugh-Hewitt, has figured out this angle, if you will. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now a little bit of Squawk Box.
University of Pennsylvania, and I'm so curious what your take is on what's happening on that campus right now, and Mark Rowan's efforts to effectively oust the president of that university as well as the lead trustee at the university. Of course, she, meaning the president of the university, Elizabeth McGill, did put out a note over the weekend. But I'd love to get your comments and thoughts and context and perspective on it all.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult, and it's not just Penn. We know it's Harvard, and, the truthfulness is that, it's true of a lot of universities on what's happening. It used to be a free speech, and then we get to a situation where certain types of speech are seemingly all right, and others you can't touch them with a 10-foot pole. And do we need to bring more balance and an actual statement about what can we allow at the universities? It's very upsetting. I mean, this could be a major impact on funding, not just on Penn and not just on Harvard, but on many universities around the country. So, yeah, it's a source of concern.
Are you?
So when you listen to this, it's complete garbage. It's an absolute waste of time. First of all, the interviewer, the socialist interviewer from Squawk Box, he's the lefty guy, their token lefty. He asks a worthless question. Why don't you give us your thoughts and your context? And this is what shapes the conversation. The question shapes the conversation. What he should have done is say, the University of Pennsylvania, this guy's trying to oust the president and the board of directors. Is he right to do so, or is he wrong to do so, and why? That's a direct question. That's something that can be answered. Now, when he said, why don't you give us your context and your all this babble, the guy that he's interviewing, named Jeremy Siegel, who is a finance professor in the Wharton School, wherever that is, he should have said to him, either that's a stupid question or it's just a question I can't answer because it doesn't make any sense, because it doesn't. What do you mean by context, etc.? And demand that the interviewer ask a direct question, or ignore the question and give the direct answer. Come back and say, this guy that is trying to oust the president is correct to do so because, and give the reasons why he's correct for doing it. But instead, Mr. Siegel babbles. He babbles his way through the conversation. Some universities this, some universities that. He clearly is scared. He's afraid. He's so afraid that he's going to say the wrong thing, and then he's going to end up getting shadow banned, or he's going to have people calling for him, especially him as a professor. Professors are definitely scared around the country. If professors say the wrong thing, the students are going to jump up and down and scream and yell, demand that he be fired or suspended or whatever, and the university will probably give in and go ahead and fire or suspend him. So he's scared to death to answer the question, and it comes across in the way he answers it. His answer is vague. His non-answer, I should put it, is vague, and it says nothing, absolutely nothing. It just wastes everyone's time. And so you need to listen for this in your conversations. Listen for it on TV, radio, when you hear people that are babbling and ask yourself, what are they doing here? Are they answering the question, or are they not answering the question? Are they maybe avoiding answering the question? Because again, we live in a cult of fear where people are scared to death to open their mouth. It doesn't have to be that way. It didn't used to be that way. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Stuart Varney's My Take.
President Biden will arrive in Israel tomorrow. It is a show of solidarity and perhaps a last-ditch attempt to avoid a full-scale invasion of Gaza. He'll also meet with Jordan's King Abdullah, Egypt's President El-Sisi, and Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas. They will discuss aid to the 1 million Palestinians trying to flee Gaza. With 2 aircraft carrier battle groups in the region, plus the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary, this is clearly an all-hands-on-deck wartime situation. Biden is staking his presidency on this. He wants to limit the casualties in Gaza without interfering in Israel's crushing of Hamas. He's talking to Israel's neighbors about who runs Gaza when Hamas is out. But most of all, he wants to avoid a wider war with Iran. That's why American military power is on full display. That's why Biden lays down a red line. Don't interfere, he says. None of this will be easy, but all of it is necessary. Now look, we could argue that this wouldn't have happened in the first place if Biden hadn't shown such weakness in so many areas. But this is where we are. It's high anxiety time. Biden leads a divided party. College campuses allow anti-Semites full reign. There's risk of attack from border-crossing terrorists, and always the risk that, yet again, Iran will upend an American president. Judgment on Joe Biden comes this week. Second hour of Varney just getting started.
So that was, again, Stuart Varney's My Take, and a lot of talk, and without saying anything. All he's doing is making it sound as though the world is a very unstable place. False. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, more of Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand.
Behavior is shaped and maintained by its consequences. Page 18. And behavior cannot really be affected by anything which follows it. But if a consequence is immediate, it may overlap the behavior. Page 120. Evolution, he asserts, to the rest. The process of operant conditioning presumably evolved when those organisms, which were more sensitively affected by the consequences of their behavior, were better able to adjust to the environment and survive. Page 120. What is this sensitivity, and through what organ or faculty does it operate? No answer. Claiming that man's first discoveries, such as banking a fire, were purely accidental, pages 121 and 122, Mr. Skinner concludes that other men learned somehow to imitate those lucky practices. One advantage in being a social animal is that one need not discover practices for oneself. Page 122. As to the time range of man's awareness, Mr. Skinner asserts, probably no one plants in the spring simply because he then harvests in the fall. Planting would not be adaptive or reasonable if there were no connection with the harvest. But one plants in the spring because of more immediate contingencies, most of them arranged by the social environment. Page 122. How is this done by a social environment consisting of men who are unable to think long range? No answer. The phenomenon of language is a problem to a mystic of muscle. Mr. Skinner gets around it semantically by calling it verbal behavior. Verbal behavior presumably arose under contingencies involving practical social interactions. Page 122. How? No answer. Verbal behavior is a means of controlling men because words, somehow, become associated with physical reinforcers. To be exact, one cannot use the word words in Mr. Skinner's context. It is sounds or marks on paper that acquire an associational link with the omnipotent reinforcers and stick inside a man's skin, forming a repertoire of verbal behavior. This would require an incredible feat of memorizing. But Mr. Skinner denies the existence of memory. He calls it storage and declares, evolutionary and environmental histories change an organism, but they are not stored within it. Pages 195 and 196. His view of the nature of language, therefore, is as simple as the views of black magic practitioners. Verbal incantations have a mystic power to effect physical changes in a living organism. The verbal community, i.e. society, Mr. Skinner asserts, is the source and cause of man's self-awareness and introspection. How? This time an answer is given. It, the verbal community, asks such questions as, what did you do yesterday? What are you doing now? What will you do tomorrow? Why did you do that? Do you really want to do that? How do you feel about that? The answers help people to adjust to each other effectively. And it is because such questions are asked that a person responds to himself and his behavior in a special way, called knowing or being aware. Without the help of a verbal community, all behavior would be unconscious. Consciousness is a social product. Page 192. But how did such questions occur to men who were incapable of discovering introspection? No answer. Apparently to appease men's defenders, Mr. Skinner offers the following. In shifting control from autonomous man to the observable environment, we do not leave an empty organism. A great deal goes on inside the skin, and physiology will eventually tell us more about it. Page 195. This means, no, man is not empty, he is a solid piece of meat. Inexorably, like all mystics, Mr. Skinner reverts to a mystic dualism, to an equivalent of the mind-body split, which becomes a body-bodies split. In Mr. Skinner's version, it is not a conflict between God and the devil, but between man's two conditioners, social environment and genetic endowment. The conflict takes place inside man's skin in the form of two selves. A self is a repertoire of behavior appropriate to a given set of contingencies. Page 199. The conflict, therefore, is between two repertoires. The controlling self, the conscious or superego, is of social origin, but the controlled self is more likely to be the product of genetic susceptibilities to reinforcement, the id, or the old Adam. The controlling self generally represents the interests of others. The controlled self, the interests of the individual. Page 199. Where have we heard this before? And for how many pre-scientific millennia? Mr. Skinner's voice is loud and clear when he declares, "To be for oneself is to be almost nothing." Page 123. As proof, he revives another ancient saw. The capacity of the human species to transmit knowledge deprives man of any claim to individuality, or to individual achievement, because he has to start by learning from others. The great individualists, so often cited to show the value of personal freedom, have owed their successes to earlier social environments. The involuntary individualism of a Robinson Crusoe and the voluntary individualism of a Henry David Thoreau show obvious debts to society. If Crusoe had reached the island as a baby, and if Thoreau had grown up unattended on the shores of Walden Pond, their stories would have been different. We must all begin as babies, and no degree of self-determination, self-sufficiency, or self-reliance will make us individuals in any sense, beyond that of single members of the human species. Pages 123 and 124. This means we all begin as babies and remain in that state. Since a baby is not self-sufficient, neither is an adult. Nothing has happened in between. Observe also the same method of setting up a straw man that was used in regard to volition. Setting it up outside of reality, e.g. in order to be an individual, Thomas A. Edison would have had to appear in the jungle by parthenogenesis as an infant without human parents, then rediscover, all by himself, the entire course of the science of physics, from the first fire to the electric light bulb. Since no one has done this, there is no such thing as individualism. From a foundation of this kind, Mr. Skinner proceeds to seek justice or fairness, or a reasonable balance, in the exchange between the individual and his social environment. Page 124. But he announces such questions cannot be answered simply by pointing to what is personally good, or what is good for others. There is another kind of value to which we must now turn. Page 125. Now, we come to the payoff. A mystic code of morality demanding self-sacrifice cannot be promulgated or propagated without a supreme ruler that becomes the collector of the sacrificing. Traditionally, there have been two such collectors, either God or society. The collector had to be inaccessible to mankind at large, and his authority had to be revealed only through an elite of special intermediaries, variously called high priests, commissars, gauleiters, etc. Mr. Skinner follows the same pattern, but he has a new collector and supreme ruler to hoist: the culture. A culture, he explains, is the customs, the customary behaviors of people. Page 127. A culture, like a species, is selected by its adaptation to an environment, to the extent that it helps its members to get what they need and avoid what is dangerous. It helps them to survive and transmit the culture. The two kinds of evolution are closely interwoven. The same people transmit both a culture and a genetic endowment, though in very different ways and for different parts of their lives. Page 129. A culture is not the product of a creative group mind or the expression of a general will. A culture evolves when new practices further the survival of those who practice them. Pages 133 and 134. Thus we owe our survival to the culture. Therefore, Mr. Skinner announces, to the two values discussed, personal good and the good of others, we must now add a third, the good of the culture. Page 134. What is the good of a culture? Survival. Whose survival? Its own. A culture is an end in itself. When it has become clear that a culture may survive or perish, some of its members may begin to act to promote its survival. Page 134. Which members? By what means are they able to grasp such a goal? No answer. Mr. Skinner stresses repeatedly that the survival of a culture is a value different from and superior to the survival of its members, of oneself or of others. A value one ought to live and die for. Why? Mr. Skinner is suddenly explicit. None of this will explain what we might call a pure concern for the survival of a culture, but we do not really need an explanation. The simple fact is that a culture which, for any reason, induces its members to work for its survival, or for the survival of some of its practices, is more likely to survive. Survival is the only value according to which a culture is eventually to be judged, and any practice that furthers survival has survival value by definition. Page 136. Whose survival? No answer. Mr. Skinner lets it ride on an equivocation of this kind. If survival is the only value according to which a culture is eventually to be judged, then the Nazi culture, which lasted 12 years, had a certain degree of value. The Soviet culture, which has lasted 55 years, has a higher value. The feudal culture of the Middle Ages, which lasted 5 centuries, had a still higher value. But the highest value of all must be ascribed to the culture of ancient Egypt, which, with no variations or motion of any kind, lasted unchanged for 30 centuries. A culture, in Mr. Skinner's own terms, is not a thing, not an idea, not even people, but a collection of practices, a behavior, a disembodied behavior that supersedes those who behave, i.e., a way of acting to which the actors must be sacrificed. This is a mysticism of a kind that makes God or society seem sensibly realistic rulers by comparison. It is also conservatism of a metaphysical kind that makes political conservatism seem innocuously childish. It demands that we live, work, and die not for ourselves or for others, but for the sake of preserving and transmitting to yet unborn generations, and in perpetuity, the way we dress, the way we ride the subway, the way we get drunk, the way we deal with baseball, or religion, or economics, etc. Thus, Mr. Skinner, the arch-materialist, ends up as a worshipper of disembodied motion, and the arch-revolutionary as a guardian of the status quo, any status quo. In order to be induced to sacrifice for the good of the culture, the victims are promised deferred advantages, indeterminately deferred. But what is an economic system's answer to the question, why should I be concerned about the survival of a particular kind of economic system? The only honest answer to that kind of question seems to be this. There is no good reason why you should be concerned, but if your culture has not convinced you that there is, so much the worse for your culture. Page 137. This means in order to survive, a culture must convince its members that there is a good reason to be concerned with its survival, even though there is none. This is social Darwinism of a kind that Herbert Spencer would not dream of. The nearest approach to an exponent in practice was Adolf Hitler, who reinforced his followers by demanding sacrifices for the survival of the German Kultur. But Mr. Skinner envisions a grander scale. He advocates a single culture for all mankind, which he admits is difficult to explain to the sacrificial victims. We can nevertheless point to many reasons why people should now be concerned for the good of all mankind. The great problems of the world today are all global, but pointing to consequences is not enough. We, who, must arrange contingencies under which consequences have an effect. Pages 137 and 138. This arranger of contingencies is to be a single totalitarian world state, serving the survival of a single culture, ruling every cell of every man's brain and every moment of his life. What are the great problems this state would solve? What are the terrifying possibilities from which we must be saved at the price of giving up our freedom, dignity, reason, mind, values, self-esteem? Mr. Skinner answers, overpopulation, the depletion of resources, the pollution of the environment, and the possibility of a nuclear holocaust. These are the not-so-remote consequences of present courses of action. Page 138. If lightning struck Mount Sinai, and Moses appeared on the mountaintop carrying sacred tablets and silenced the lost, frightened, desperate throng below in order to read a revelation of divine wisdom, and read a third-rate editorial from a random tabloid, the dramatic, intellectual, and moral effect would be similar, except that Moses was less pretentious. Mr. Skinner's book falls to pieces in its final chapters. The author's verbal behavior becomes so erratic that he sounds as if he has lost all interest in his subject. Tangled in contradictions, equivocations, and non sequiturs, he seems to stumble wearily in circles, seizing any rationalization at random, not to defend his thesis, but to attack his critics, throwing feeble little jabs, projecting an odd kind of stale, lethargic, perfunctory malice, almost a reflex malice. He sounds like a man filling empty pages with something, anything, in order to circumvent the accumulated weight of unanswered questions, or like a man who resents being questioned. Who will be the designers of his proposed global culture and the rulers of mankind? He answers unequivocally, the technologists of behavior. What qualifies them for such a job? They are scientists. What is science? In the whole of the book, no definition is given, as if the term were a self-evident, mystically hallowed primary. Since man, according to Mr. Skinner, is biologically unable to project a time span of 3 months, from spring planting to fall harvest, how are these technologists able to see the course and plan the future of a global culture? No answer. What sort of men are they? The closest approach to an answer is those who have been induced by their culture to act to further its survival. Page 180. It is futile to ask by what means and through what agencies the culture, i.e. the behavior, of bird-brained creatures can accomplish such a feat, because here we are obviously dealing with a standard requirement of mysticism. Mr. Skinner is establishing an opportunity for the high priesthood to hear voices, not the voice of God or of the people, but the voice of the culture, inducing them to act. But the culture induces a great many people to different courses of action, including the people who paint prophecies of doom on rocks by the side of the highways. How are the culture designers and the rest of us to know that theirs is the true voice of the culture? No answer. One must assume that they feel it. Now we come to the grand cashing in on the book's basic equivocation. Mr. Skinner keeps stressing that mankind needs more controls, not less. In a polemic passage, he quotes his critics asking, "Who is to control?" and answers them as follows. The relation between the controller and the controlled is reciprocal. The scientist in the laboratory, studying the behavior of a pigeon, designs contingencies and observes their effects. His apparatus exerts a conspicuous control on the pigeon, but we must not overlook the control exerted by the pigeon. The behavior of the pigeon has determined the design of the apparatus and the procedures in which it is used. Some such reciprocal control is characteristic of all science. Here I omit one sentence which is an unconscionable misuse of a famous statement. Continuing.
And that was Chapter 13 of Philosophy Who Needs It by Ayn Rand. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.